The scent of pine and roast turkey filled the house I've guarded for 50 Christmases when my son, Ethan, rose from his chair like a man about to propose, except what he proposed was my erasure. He palmed a place card that said Raphael Miller and slid it to the head of the table, the chair my late husband built with his hands, and I have kept warm for 12 years. Then he looked straight at me, smiled a thin, ambitious smile, and said, "This seat is for my boss, Mom. Please move." And before my brain could catch up to my ears, his hand clamped my shoulder and shoved. Crystal cracked, gravy sloshed, and I hit the hardwood with a thud that sucked the air out of the room. Savannah gasped. My neighbor Clarice froze with the pie server midair, and Raphael himself stood in the doorway, coat still on, surprise on his face, watching the woman who invited him for Christmas sprawl on her own floor because her son wanted to impress him. For 3 heartbeats, no one spoke. I smelled spilled red wine, beeswax from the candles, and something else burning pride while Ethan puffed up like a conquering hero at the head of a table that wasn't his. "It's just a chair, Monica," Savannah tried, her voice paper-thin. "We don't need a scene." But it wasn't a chair. It was the last unbroken border in a house where my wedding portrait had been exiled to the basement as clutter, where my husband's sedan came back with a fist-sized dent and a shrug, where a repair card meant for the furnace turned into beachfront cocktails on my dime because mental health matters. I stood with the help of the only person who moved my 11-year-old grandson. Noah and I saw it clearly. They believed they could push me out of a chair, then out of decisions, then out of my home, and call it family. Raphael cleared his throat awkwardly. "Miss Davis, Merry Christmas," I said evenly, smoothing my dress as my hip pulsed with a dull ache. I watched Ethan hand Raphael the honor seat, like a dog bringing a stick, and thought of the late-night whispers I'd pretended not to hear all year. If Ethan could prove he managed a big asset, my house, maybe the boss would see him as a man who finishes what he starts. I took my side place at the table and let dinner limp forward, each clink a tiny betrayal, each glance from my daughter a plea not to disturb the illusion. The illusion ended at 2:11 a.m. When I reached for water and heard the soft hiss of voices from the guest room, they'd claimed, "She'll sign power of attorney after the holidays," Ethan said, "and if not, conservatorship." Raphael's lawyer walked me through it. "We sell the house, buy near the lake, set her up someplace nice and clean like I'm a stain." I didn't knock, didn't cry, didn't beg. I went to the basement instead, to the fireproof box under the desk they buried in winter coats and broken promises, and I touched the key my husband hung around my neck the day we signed the papers. He called our fortress. People think power is loud. Power is a page. Power is a signature aligned exactly over your printed name, and a seal that bites paper like a small, satisfied animal. As the oven timer ticked in the dark kitchen and the tree lights winked like indifferent stars, I decided exactly how this story would end, with a notarized amendment that made Ethan and Savannah vanish from my trust as if they never existed, and a 30-day notice that would end their free stay in my home clean, legal, irreversible. So when morning came and coffee bloomed in the grinder, I placed a white envelope against the machine they bought with my card and sat in my bedroom chair to read while the house woke up. I heard the rip at 9:14, the sound of certainty tearing and the stomp down the hallway, the door banging the wall, Ethan's face blotchy red, Savannah's mascara river eyes behind him. "Is this some kind of joke?" he barked, waving the notice. "You can't do this. We live here." "You've been living here," I said, and the calm in my voice scared even me. "There's a difference." He tried volume. I used silence. He tried guilt. I picked up my glasses and polished the lenses until his reflection steadied, a grown boy who pushed his mother for a pat on the head from his boss. Here is the part you need to hear, because it may be your life in another kitchen with another bully. By the time the sun set on Christmas Day, I would have 2 pieces of paper, one a shield, one a sword, and both would carry the weight of law heavier than any shove from any ungrateful child. If you've ever been made small in your own home, tell me where you're watching from in the comments, and hit subscribe. Stay with me. Because in the next chapter you'll see exactly how one signature can turn humiliation into eviction, and how a nice, clean facility becomes a locked door they can't open from the outside. For years, I told myself family comes first, that sacrifices are what mothers do, but looking back, I see the small betrayals stacked like bricks, each one building the wall that hemmed me in until Ethan's shove on Christmas finally toppled the illusion. 3 years ago, he came home with Savannah after yet another failed investment, all sheepish smiles and promises of 6 months, just 6 months, until they got back on their feet. I agreed. Of course I agreed. What kind of mother turns away her only son? But 6 months became a year, then 2, then 3, until their voices filled every corner of my house and mine had grown hushed. My sewing room became their bedroom. My favorite novels, the ones I read with Charles when we were young, were boxed and shoved into the basement. Ethan called it making the house more modern. I called it eviction by inches. The first real crack came with Charles's sedan. That car was more than metal. It was the smell of his aftershave in the upholstery, the careful way he'd wipe the dashboard on Saturday mornings, the independence I clung to after his funeral. Ethan borrowed it for a meeting important, he said, a chance to pitch an idea. He brought it back late and parked at the far end of the driveway. The next morning, the passenger side door bore a dent the size of my fist, the paint scraped down to the steel. I asked, calmly at first. He didn't even look up from his coffee. Some idiot in the parking lot. Not my fault. No apology, no offer to repair, just a shrug. When I pressed, he snapped, "Mom, it's a 20-year-old car. It's probably worth more as scrap. Why do you care?" I cared because it was the last thing his father touched. And I cared because Ethan didn't. Then came the furnace. That spring, it died during an unseasonably cold week. Ethan made a show of pacing the kitchen, talking about costs he couldn't cover, how Noah would freeze. Against my better judgment, I gave him my emergency credit card. "For the furnace and nothing else," I said. A week later, I saw pictures on Savannah's social media. Sandy beaches, neon cocktails, hashtags like number blessed and number mental health break. The furnace repair was on the bill $4,200. So were airline tickets and a resort package that pushed the total to nearly $16,000. When I confronted them, Ethan bristled. "We were burning out. You don't understand what stress does to a marriage. Besides, you never used that card." Savannah, standing beside him, added softly, "We'll pay you back, I promise." 6 months have passed, not a single dollar. But the worst wasn't money or cars. The worst was my living room. Every photograph, every chair, every shelf told our story. My wedding portrait is above the fireplace. Charles sat in the armchair while reading the paper. The little table that held family albums. One afternoon, I returned from the grocery store, and everything was gone. In its place, a cold gray sofa, a huge television mounted like a black mirror swallowing the room. My portrait leaned cracked against a stack of boxes in the damp basement. I remember clutching the frame, my hands trembling with anger I barely recognized. "We wanted to surprise you, Mom," Savannah whispered, tears in her eyes. "Make it more modern." Ethan crossed his arms and called it decluttering. My life, my memories decluttered. That was the rhythm. Disrespect disguised as practicality, theft wrapped in excuses, and me the fool choosing peace over confrontation. I told myself it wasn't worth a fight. But every time I chose silence, I permitted them. By the time Christmas arrived, my house was no longer mine in anything but deed. The head chair at the table, the last symbol of order, was all I had left. And Ethan stole that too, not even for himself, but to impress another man. I lay in bed after the shove, replaying each incident like old film reels. The dent in the car, the stolen vacation, the desecrated living room. None of it had been accidents. It was a campaign, slow and deliberate, to strip me of identity and ownership until I became a tolerated guest in my own life. Ethan thought he had won, that I would limp away, embarrassed, and continue shrinking. But humiliation is a crucible. It doesn't always break you. Sometimes it burns away the illusions and leaves only steel. That night, as the Christmas lights blinked meaningless patterns on the wall, I whispered to myself, "They want control, but I still hold the paper, the trust, the deed, the power they underestimated." I closed my eyes, the ache in my hip a steady drum, and saw Charles's face the day we signed the trust documents. "This house is your fortress," he had said. "Don't let anyone take it." I hadn't planned on becoming a warrior at 61, but warriors aren't always made by choice. Sometimes they're made by betrayal. And the war began the moment my son thought a chair mattered more than his mother. If you've ever had your kindness mistaken for weakness, you'll want to stay with me because what came next was not surrender. It was a strategy. And it started with a midnight walk to the basement. The house was still, the kind of silence that follows a storm. The laughter and clinking of glasses from dinner had died hours earlier, but I couldn't sleep. My hip throbbed from the fall, and humiliation pulsed hotter than pain. At 2:11 a.m., thirsty and restless, I slipped out of bed for a glass of water. The floorboards beneath my bare feet creaked the way they always had, a familiar chorus in a house I once ruled. But halfway down the hallway, I froze. Light spilled in a thin golden line beneath the guest room door, the room that used to be my sewing sanctuary before Ethan and Savannah claimed it. Voices, low but sharp, drifted into the hall. I hadn't meant to listen, but then I heard my name. "She'll sign it after the holidays," Ethan whispered, his tone hard and calculating. "She has to. If not, we'll go through with the conservatorship. Raphael's lawyer already told me how simple it is." My stomach clenched, bile rising. Conservatorship. It wasn't just a word to me, it was a weapon. For 35 years I'd filed documents, balanced ledgers, and seen families torn apart in courtrooms over that exact process. I knew what it meant, stripping me of my rights, painting me as incompetent, making me legally invisible while they took everything. Savannah's voice trembled, but not with outrage, only with vanity. "But what will people think if we put her in a facility? My friends already say living here with your mom is unusual." "A nursing home, Ethan? It looks terrible." I pressed my palm against the wallpaper, forcing myself to stay silent. Not once did she say, "How dare you treat your mother like this?" Not once did she defend me. Her only concern was reputation, not betrayal. "She's stubborn," Ethan hissed. "But she's old. She'll break. Once the papers are signed, the house is ours. We can sell it for at least $950,000, buy near the lake, and finally have a place to show Raphael. He needs to see I'm a man who can manage assets. This house proves it." The words sliced through me sharper than any blade. I wasn't just an inconvenience, they saw me as a stepping stone. My home, my life, my very existence was nothing but leverage for Ethan's career. I wanted to slam the door open, to scream, to shake them both until they remembered I was flesh and blood, not a problem to be solved, but I didn't. Instead, I let the venom pour over me, coating every wound until resolve hardened in my bones. I turned and walked back down the hall, each step measured, silent, a soldier retreating not from defeat but to plan the counterattack. In my room, I sat in the dark, the glow from the neighbors' Christmas lights seeping through the curtains, and I listened to my own breathing. For a long time, I thought I was paralyzed by grief. But the truth? I was sharpening. The words, "nice clean facility," echoed, sour and sterile. They weren't talking about care. They were talking about storage, about hiding me where I couldn't interfere, where my voice would be muffled behind antiseptic walls. And all because my own son wanted to impress another man at the expense of his mother. I thought of Noah, my grandson, asleep in the next room. What would he think years from now, if he learned his father had cast his grandmother aside for a promotion? Would he see it as ambition or cruelty? My heart broke for him, but that heartbreak only fanned the fire inside me. He deserved better than this example. He deserved to see that silence doesn't mean surrender. By the time the clock struck 3, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to argue. I was going to do what I had spent decades of my life doing. Handle the paperwork, the numbers, the signatures that decide who truly holds power. Ethan thought he had already won because he could push me out of a chair. What he didn't know was that by sunrise I would be holding documents far stronger than his ambition. I slipped under the covers again, not to rest, but to wait. Sleep never came. Instead, I pictured the fireproof lockbox in the basement, the one Ethan and Savannah stacked with their junk and dismissed as worthless. Inside was the trust Charles and I had created, the fortress he promised would protect me when I needed it most. I'd never believed I'd have to use it against my own child. But betrayal has a way of rearranging what you think you know about love. When the first hint of dawn brushed the sky, I rose, combed my hair, and buttoned a sweater, with hands that no longer trembled. Today, I thought, they will see who I truly am. If you've ever stood outside a door and overheard words meant to erase you, stay with me. Because in the next chapter, You'll watch how a single lockbox in a dusty basement became my weapon, and how a woman they dismissed as too old turned their scheme into rubble before they could even taste victory. The stairs groaned under my weight as I descended into the basement, the air heavy with dust and the faint scent of mildew. To Ethan and Savannah, this was a storage pit, a graveyard for anything that didn't fit their modern vision of the house. To me, it was sacred ground. Down here lived the pieces of my life they'd tried to bury: Charles's old armchair, the stack of photo albums, the cracked glass of our wedding portrait leaning sadly against a wall. They had shoved my memories into the dark, but they had forgotten what else I kept here, the fortress my husband and I built out of ink and signatures decades ago. I pushed aside a box of Savannah's shoes, another of Noah's outgrown toys, and finally slid a heavy trunk away from the desk they'd piled with broken holiday decorations. On my knees, I reached beneath and found it cold, solid, black, the fireproof lockbox. My fingers trembled as I pulled the chain from around my neck. For 30 years I had worn this key, a gift from Charles the day we finished the paperwork that sealed our future. He'd said, "This isn't just paper, Monica. It's armor. It's your fortress." The lock gave a satisfying click. I lifted the lid, and the smell of old paper rose like incense from an altar. Inside were the building blocks of our life: birth certificates, Charles's honorable military discharge, the deed to the house we bought when interest rates were sky high and hope was even higher. Beneath those, wrapped in a leather folder worn soft by years, was the document I had come for. The title gleamed in bold serif letters: The Monica and Charles Davis Revocable Living Trust. I traced the words with my fingertip as though they were a spell carved in stone. I remembered the afternoon we signed it, sitting in a lawyer's office with the weight of responsibility pressing down, but also the strange comfort of security. Charles had insisted on a trust, not just a will. A will can be challenged, he had said, looking me straight in the eyes. But a trust? A trust is iron. If anything happens to me, you'll be safe. This house will always be yours. Reading through the clauses now, I felt his presence at my shoulder. The language was dense but familiar, like an old hymn I'd recited 1,000 times. I, as the sole surviving trustee, held full authority to manage and amend everything inside the trust. The most important asset listed was our house, appraised now at $950,000. Ethan and Savannah were named as beneficiaries, yes, but that word revocable sang louder than anything else on the page. I could remove them in a heartbeat, and tonight I would. Kneeling there on the cold concrete floor, I nearly laughed. Ethan thought he was clever because Raphael's lawyer had whispered conservatorship into his ear. He had no idea his mother had spent 3 decades working with documents just like this, watching families destroy each other in court. He had no idea his little scheme had walked straight into the walls of a fortress built before he even knew how to spell his name. I closed my eyes for a moment, gripping the leather folder to my chest. For the first time since Charles passed, I didn't feel alone. His foresight was here, wrapping around me, reminding me I was not a helpless widow but the keeper of an arsenal. All these years, I had thought of the trust as something distant, a formality gathering dust. Now I understood it was a weapon waiting for the day I needed to fight back. I slid the papers back into the folder and locked the box. Standing was harder than kneeling. My hips screamed from the fall, but I welcomed the pain. It kept me sharp. I placed the chain back around my neck and tucked the key inside my sweater, close to my heart. That small piece of metal was more powerful than Ethan's shouting, more enduring than Savannah's crocodile tears. As I climbed the stairs, I felt taller with every step. Upstairs, the house looked the same, stockings hung by the fireplace, tinsel glinting under the tree lights. But I was no longer the same woman who had been pushed to the floor. They thought they had humiliated me into silence. What they didn't know was that humiliation had unlocked my resolve. In my bedroom, I laid the trust on my desk. My hands no longer shook as I opened a fresh folder of stationery and lined up a pen. Years of balancing books and drafting contracts had trained me for this moment. The plan formed in my head with mechanical precision. Amend the trust to cut Ethan and Savannah out, draft a 30-day eviction notice, and call a notary before the sun rose. Every word would be airtight, every line a chain link in the armor Charles left me. They wanted to declare me incompetent, By dawn, the only incompetence in this house would be theirs for underestimating the mother they had mistaken for prey. If you've ever been cornered in your own home, keep listening. In the next chapter, you'll see how one midnight phone call set the stage for a legal storm, and how I turned the weight of law into a hammer that no amount of shouting could shatter. The clock read 5:47 a.m. when I set the trust folder squarely on my desk and opened my phone. I had spent the last 2 hours drafting language, each sentence neat and deliberate, the way Charles used to compliment when he caught me balancing ledgers after dinner. My penmanship had steadied, the tremor of humiliation replaced by something colder, sharper. What I needed now wasn't courage, it was procedure. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the business card I'd tucked away years ago, a precaution most people never think to take. Mobile notary, 24 hours. I pressed the number and held the phone to my ear. A woman answered on the second ring, her voice alert despite the hour. Mobile notary, this is Maria. How may I help you? Good morning, Maria, I said, my tone professional measured. My name is Monica Davis. I need a notary at my residence as soon as possible to witness and certify 2 legal documents. There was no hesitation. I can be there by 7, Mrs. Davis. Will that work? Perfect, I replied. Thank you. I ended the call, slid the phone onto the desk, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. It was done. The gears were turning. I pulled a sheet of cream-colored stationery from the drawer and began to write. The amendment came first. The words were simple, precise. I, Monica Davis, as sole trustee, do hereby amend the list of beneficiaries of the Monica and Charles Davis Revocable Living Trust, removing Ethan Davis and Savannah Davis effective immediately. With those lines, the future they had been plotting dissolved like sugar in hot tea. Next came the eviction notice. I cited their hostile conduct, their abusive behavior, the pattern of financial exploitation. I gave them 30 days to vacate the premises. My handwriting was crisp, even elegant, each curve of ink a quiet declaration of war. This wasn't a mother's plea, it was a property owner's command. By the time the sun stretched its first pale fingers across the frosted lawn outside, the documents lay neatly side by side, ready for Maria's seal. I changed into a navy sweater, brushed my hair, and applied a touch of lipstick. Not vanity armor. I needed them to see a woman in control, not a victim bruised from the night before. At 7:12 a.m., headlights swept across my driveway. A small silver sedan stopped, and out stepped a woman with a briefcase, her coat buttoned tight against the cold. She rang the bell, and I greeted her in the kitchen, the very room where hours earlier I had been humiliated. Mrs. Davis? She asked. Yes, please come in. Maria set her ledger on the table, her movements crisp, efficient. She examined my documents, checked my identification, and nodded. Everything is in order. As she uncapped her seal and pressed it into the ink pad, I felt something shift inside me. Last night I was sprawled on this floor, wine staining my dress, my family watching in silence. Now, as her stamp thudded against the page, the power was mine again. She notarized the amendment first. My signature came out bold and firm, not a waver in sight. Then the eviction notice. Each press of her seal echoed like a drumbeat, steady and final. In less than 15 minutes she packed her briefcase, I paid her fee, and she was gone quiet, professional, leaving behind 2 documents that were as immovable as stone. I stood alone in the kitchen, the papers spread before me. They looked so small, so harmless, just a few sheets of paper. But I knew better. One was a shield that guarded my fortress. The other was a sword poised at the throats of those who had mistaken my silence for surrender. I slipped the eviction notice into a crisp white envelope and wrote 2 names in careful cursive, Ethan and Savannah. My pen didn't shake, my heart didn't falter. This was not vengeance, it was survival. I glanced at the coffee maker, that gleaming machine they had proudly bought with my credit card last year. Every morning Ethan stomped into this kitchen, demanding his caffeine like a king calling for tribute. That was where I would place the envelope, right in front of the machine. Impossible to miss. As I propped it against the sugar bowl, I smiled not with joy, but with resolve. Their free ride ended today. Their arrogance had met its match in the quiet strength of a woman they thought too old to matter. I returned to my room, settled into Charles's armchair by the window, and opened a book. The house was silent now, but not for long. Soon the thud of heavy footsteps would fill the hallway, followed by the sound of paper tearing. And when it did, I would not move. I would not flinch. I would simply watch as they discovered that the fortress they had tried to storm had always belonged to me and that the law itself was on my side. If you've ever been told you're powerless, stay with me. In the next chapter, you'll hear how one torn envelope shattered their illusion of control and how silence can be the loudest answer of all. The kitchen was hushed in that peculiar way houses feel just before everyone wakes, when the night still clings to the corners but daylight presses insistently through the blinds. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. On the counter, propped against the sugar bowl in front of the shiny stainless steel coffee maker they'd bought with my card, sat the white envelope. It looked innocent, almost decorative, but I knew it was dynamite waiting for a careless hand to light the fuse. I positioned it there at 7:30, after Maria left and the ink of the notary's seal had dried. Then I retreated to my bedroom armchair with a book on my lap. Though I wasn't reading, I was listening. Listening for the familiar stomp of Ethan's feet, the entitled rhythm that always meant demands were coming. At 9:14, the silence broke. His tread shook the floorboards, then came the click of the grinder, the whir of water heating, a pause, a beat of silence stretched too long. I imagined his brow furrowing, his hand reaching out. Then came the rip paper tearing open, crisp and loud. "What the—" His voice cracked, disbelief tangled with anger. "Savannah, get in here." I heard hurried footsteps, her softer but frantic, the shuffle of paper changing hands, then a gasp that could have shattered glass. "Oh my God," Savannah whispered. A chair scraped, footsteps thundered down the hallway. The door to my room flew open so violently that it slammed against the wall, rattling the frames of the photographs I had managed to keep. Ethan burst in. The eviction notice crumpled in his fist. His face was blotchy red, his eyes wild. Savannah hovered behind him, mascara already streaking. "What is this?" he snarled, shaking the paper like a weapon. "Some kind of senile joke? You can't do this!" I didn't answer. Instead, I slid a bookmark into the novel on my lap and set it gently on the side table. I folded my hands, calm, deliberate. My silence was gasoline on his fire. He stormed closer, towering over me, his breath hot with fury. "This is our home. We live here. You can't just kick us out." No, I said quietly, lifting my gaze to meet his. "You have been living here. There's a difference, and your visit is over." Savannah rushed forward, tears streaming, her hands clasped in desperate prayer. "Mom, please. 30 days? On Christmas? We have nowhere to go. You can't mean this." But I did. And I let the silence after my words stretch long enough for them to hear their own panic echoing back. Ethan's voice dropped to a low growl. "You've lost it. You're not fit to make decisions anymore. Maybe Raphael's lawyer was right. Maybe it's time we take control before you hurt yourself." There it was, spoken aloud at last. The threat they had whispered in the dark now bared its teeth in the daylight. My stomach knotted, but not with fear, with clarity. I adjusted my glasses, polishing the lenses slowly, carefully, as though their fury were nothing but dust to wipe away. For years, their tactics had worked. His rage frightened me. Her tears guilted me. I had always been the one to apologize, to cave, to sacrifice my peace for theirs. But this time was different. This time, I had the law in my hands. I watched them unravel in front of me. Ethan was pacing, his fists clenching and unclenching, his voice rising and cracking. Savannah sobbed, her eyes darting to me for mercy that would not come. They expected me to fight, to scream, to defend myself. What they didn't expect was a mirror, and that's what my silence became, a reflection of their own ugliness. "Think about Noah," Savannah cried suddenly, clutching at the only weapon left. "Your grandson. You'd really throw your own grandson out on the street?" I finally moved. I picked up my reading glasses and slipped them on, the world snapping into sharp clarity. I am not throwing Noah out. I am saving him from watching his father destroy what doesn't belong to him. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Neither of them spoke. For the first time in years, they were listening not because I was louder, but because I was immovable. They had tried rage. They had tried guilt. They had tried threats. None of it mattered now. The envelope on the counter had already detonated, and its blast radius was legal, final, inescapable. I leaned back in my chair, calm as winter frost. You have 30 days. Use them wisely. Oh, if you've ever been shouted at in your own home, if you've ever been told you're powerless, let this sink in. Silence can be sharper than a blade when backed by the weight of truth. And in the next chapter, you'll see how I laid out every word they whispered in the dark, how I repeated their own conspiracy to their faces, and how the fight drained out of them the moment they realized they were already defeated. The room held its breath. Ethan still clutched the eviction notice, his knuckles white, while Savannah's sobs rattled against the silence. My heart thudded, not from fear but from anticipation. For years, I'd been the one cornered by their excuses, their theatrics. Not today. Today, I would wield the sharpest weapon of all their own words. I folded my hands in my lap, steady as stone. You think this is a joke. You think I've lost my mind. I let my eyes settle on Ethan and then drift deliberately to Savannah. But I heard everything you said last night. Savannah froze mid-breath, her mascara-streaked face draining of color. Ethan blinked, confusion flashing into panic before he masked it with anger. What are you talking about? He barked, but his voice cracked on the last syllable. At 2:11 inches the morning, I said calmly. I walked past your room on the way to get water, and I heard you. My tone was as measured as a court stenographer reading testimony. I heard you plan to force me to sign over power of attorney. I heard you whisper about filing for conservatorship if I refused, and I heard your exact words, Ethan. She's a stubborn old woman in the way. He took a step back as if I'd struck him. You're twisting. I cut him off. And I heard the rest, that once you had control, you'd sell my house for $950,000, buy near the lake, and put me in a nice, clean facility. I spit the phrase back at them, cold and precise. A facility, like I'm clutter to be swept out with the rest of your mess. Savannah's legs buckled, and she sank onto the edge of my bed, covering her mouth. A broken whimper escaped her throat. For once, the tears weren't an act. They were the sobs of someone seeing the scaffold of lies collapse beneath them. Ethan, though, tried to recover. His voice rose, desperate now. You're lying. You didn't hear. Do not insult me further, I snapped, my voice slicing through the air. I don't need to invent words when yours condemn you well enough. The silence that followed was crushing. They couldn't deny it. They couldn't spin it. Their plan lay naked and ugly in the daylight, and there was nothing left for them to hide behind. I stood slowly, my hip aching but my spine straight. For the first time in years, I felt tall. This amendment, I said, pointing to the notarized document still on my desk, removes you both from my trust. Whatever inheritance you thought was yours has evaporated with the stroke of a pen. Savannah sobbed harder, rocking forward and back. No, Mom, please, we didn't mean... And this, I continued, holding up the eviction notice, gives you 30 days to leave. 30 days to pack your lies and your arrogance and take them elsewhere. This is no longer your refuge. It is no longer your free ride. It was never your house to begin with. Ethan's face twisted between fury and fear. For years he had bullied me with volume and puffed himself up with arrogance. Now he looked like a boy caught stealing cookies. Except this time the cookies were my life, my home, my dignity. He tried one last card, his voice dropping to a low, venomous growl. You'll regret this. You need me. You'll get lonely. You'll see. I let the words settle, then answered with steel. I don't need you. I needed a son. What I got was a predator, and I am done feeding predators in my own home. For the first time since the confrontation began, he had no comeback. His mouth opened, then closed. His chest rose and fell in shallow bursts. Savannah clutched his arm, but he shook her off and stormed toward the door. The sound of his heavy footsteps faded down the hall. Savannah lingered a moment longer, her face blotchy, her lips trembling. Please, Mom, she whispered. Think of Noah. I am thinking of Noah, I said, my voice softer but no less firm. That's why this ends now. He deserves to grow up watching his grandmother stand, not watching her be trampled. Her eyes filled with shame before she followed her husband out. The door slammed behind them, rattling the frames again, but this time I didn't flinch. The silence they left was thick, but not suffocating. It was cleansing, like the moment after a storm when the air is raw and sharp and alive. I sank back into Charles's chair, exhausted but unbroken. The war had moved into the open, and I had drawn the first real blood, not with fists, not with shouting, but with the truth they thought would remain hidden. If you've ever been dismissed as weak, remember this: nothing is sharper than repeating a betrayer's own words to their face. And in the next chapter, you'll see how 30 days of silence in one house can unravel the carefully polished lives of people who thought they would never be held accountable. The notice lay on the counter like a ticking clock, each day tearing another sheet from the life Ethan and Savannah had built out of my resources. They didn't leave right away. They couldn't. Instead, the house became a stage for a strange, suffocating play, 3 actors sharing a roof, pretending civility while the walls groaned with tension. Ethan no longer stomped through rooms as though he owned them. His voice, once brash and booming, retreated to urgent whispers behind the closed door of the guest room. I caught fragments through the vents, pleading with banks, bargaining with credit card companies. "What do you mean my score's too low? I've been a client for years," he argued one morning, his tone stripped of confidence. By the end of the week, I heard him denied for 3 different loans, the last rejection leaving him muttering curses under his breath. The man who once boasted about million-dollar deals couldn't secure $5,000 to his name. Savannah tried another tactic. Where Ethan was noise, she was soft, deliberate manipulation. One afternoon, I returned from tending the winter garden to find an old scrapbook lying open on the coffee table. Photographs stared up at me, Ethan, as a boy with a missing front tooth, me at his high school graduation, our arms entwined. Noah's first birthday, frosting smeared across his cheeks. It was a carefully arranged display of nostalgia, meant to tug at strings she thought were still attached. I looked at the images, felt the pang of memory, then closed the book gently and slid it back onto the shelf. The past is not a weapon, I thought. Not anymore. Clarice came by with a pie, her voice low but fierce. "You're doing the right thing, Monica. Don't let them break you down." She glanced toward the guest room, then back at me. "I've seen men like him before, all bluster, no backbone. Keep steady." Her presence reminded me that even in solitude, I wasn't alone. Evelyn, my younger sister, called often. She told me, "Boundaries don't mean you've stopped loving your son, they mean you've started loving yourself." Each word was a shield against the temptation to cave. Noah was the hardest part. He still padded into the kitchen every morning, rubbing sleep from his eyes, his small voice asking if I'd make pancakes the way I used to. His innocence made my heart ache. He didn't deserve the chaos his parents had created. I cooked for him, listened to him chatter about superheroes and math homework, and tucked every laugh into the empty spaces where loneliness tried to creep. For him, I stayed steady. For him, I refused to waver. Ethan and Savannah's desperation grew as the deadline crept closer. They no longer bickered with me directly. Instead, they pleaded with shadows. I overheard Savannah on the phone with her mother, her voice pitched high with panic. "We can't just move into some dump. You don't understand, this house was supposed to be ours." The silence on the other end must have been heavy because Savannah burst into sobs before hanging up. Ethan, meanwhile, tried to resurrect connections. I heard him calling Raphael once, the tone of a man begging for crumbs. "Mr. Miller, I just need more time. I can prove I'm reliable." This whole thing with my mother, it's complicated. There was no warmth in his voice when he hung up, only the hollow thud of defeat. The house became unbearably quiet. No arguments, no laughter, just the sound of days slipping by. I read novels in the armchair Charles used to favor. I pruned the brittle winter stems in my garden. I drank tea, the steam warming my face, while upstairs Ethan paced like a caged animal. Their silence was not peace, it was panic, gnawing at them while I sat still, immovable. On the 20th day, Savannah knocked on my door. Her eyes were swollen, her voice trembling. "Mom, please, can we talk? 30 days isn't enough. We just need a little more time." I set down my book and met her gaze. "Savannah, 30 days is what the law allows. I have given you that. I will not give you more." She pressed her hands together, searching for pity, but there was none left to give. When she left, I closed the door gently behind her, not with malice but with finality. The deadline loomed like a storm on the horizon. Every tick of the clock, every creak of the house, carried weight. They thought 30 days would be long enough to sway me, to bend me back into the pliable woman I once was. They didn't realize 30 days was long enough only to expose the cracks in their illusion, long enough for them to watch their scaffolding crumble one splinter at a time. If you've ever lived under the same roof as betrayal, you know silence can be the cruelest sound. But sometimes silence is also justice, the steady count of a clock that refuses to pause. And in the next chapter, you'll hear how Ethan, cornered and desperate, reached outside these walls for rescue and found only closed doors. By the 22nd day, the tension in the house was so thick it felt like breathing through wet wool. The Christmas lights still clung to the porch outside, faded now, their cheerfulness mocking the reality inside. Ethan had stopped looking me in the eye. Savannah had stopped pretending. And Noah, sweet Noah, was the only one who still moved through the rooms with the innocence of a child unaware that his world was collapsing. Ethan spent hours in the guest room, the door shut, his voice a muffled drone through the walls, sometimes angry, sometimes desperate, always pleading. One evening, while I sat in the living room knitting, his voice carried clearly enough for me to catch every word. "Dad, I know," he said, his tone low but urgent. "I should have saved. I should have handled things differently. But we don't have anywhere to go. Chloe's a wreck, Noah's. He needs stability. Just let us stay with you for a little while. Just until I can get things sorted." There was silence on the other end, but I could imagine Raphael stoic, disappointed. A man who once boasted about his son's ambition is now listening to him beg. Ethan's voice cracked. "No, I understand. I know it's a lot to ask. I just thought—" His words trailed off, heavy with humiliation. The line went dead, and for the first time since this began, I heard him cry. A harsh, guttural sound, the kind of sobs a grown man makes when the mask finally cracks. He didn't know I was listening. I sat frozen, not with pity, but with a clarity that chilled me. Even his father, his idol, his excuse for arrogance had closed the door on him. If Raphael wouldn't save him, no one would. Savannah tried her own methods. She called old friends, spun half-truths into pleas. "It's just temporary," I heard her say one afternoon, her voice syrupy. "We just need a few months until things smooth out." But friends who once enjoyed cocktails with her at expensive restaurants weren't eager to share their spare rooms. By the end of each call, her voice cracked with frustration, the mask of composure slipping further each time. I could see it in their bodies now, too. Ethan's shoulders, once squared with false confidence, slumped as he paced the hall. Savannah's carefully styled hair went unwashed, her manicures chipped. Even their arguments shrank to whispers. It was as if the walls themselves pressed in, reminding them that their days here were numbered. Meanwhile, I carried on with a quiet dignity that unsettled them more than anger ever could. I read in Charles's chair, brewed tea, and watered the plants by the window. Every action was deliberate, steady, a reminder that the house belonged to me and always had. I no longer needed to shout or argue. The law, the trust, and time were all speaking louder than I ever could. Noah sensed it, though he didn't understand. One evening, he padded into my room holding his favorite toy truck. "Grandma, are we moving?" His wide brown eyes searched mine for reassurance. I swallowed hard. "Yes, sweetheart, but you'll be okay. You'll always be okay with me." He climbed into my lap, resting his head against my chest. "I like it here," he murmured. "It smells like cookies." Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them back. I couldn't falter now, not when the example he needed most was strength. On the 25th day, Savannah made one last attempt. She stood in the kitchen, wringing her hands, while Ethan leaned against the counter, hollow-eyed. "Mom," she said softly, "maybe we can work something out. Maybe we pay rent? A little every month? Just until we get back on our feet?" I looked at her, then at Ethan. The same man who had pushed me to the floor, who had called me a stubborn old woman, who had plotted to sell the house beneath me. I let the silence sit heavily before I answered. "No, your time here is over. The papers are legal. The date is final." Savannah's face crumpled. Ethan slammed his fist against the counter, the sound sharp and desperate. But there was no power in it anymore, just frustration, the tantrum of a man who had run out of options. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized something profound. Their fear of leaving wasn't about losing a roof. It was about losing control over me. They had grown fat and comfortable on my silence, on my willingness to bend. Without me, they would have to face the world on their own terms, and they weren't prepared. The days that followed were quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence. Not the suffocating dread of secrets whispered in the dark, but the heavy countdown of inevitability. Every box they packed, every call they made, every door closed in their faces was another step toward the reckoning they couldn't avoid. If you've ever waited out a storm, you know this stillness before the final break. That was where we stood. Me steady in my fortress, them scrambling in the ruins of their schemes. And in the next chapter, you'll see how the 30th day arrived, gray and unforgiving, and how the moving truck in my driveway marked the end of their reign and the beginning of my peace. The morning of the 30th day dawned gray and unforgiving, the kind of sky that seemed to press down on the world. I sat by the window in Charles's chair, a cup of tea warming my hands, watching the driveway. I knew what was coming, though part of me had wondered if they would cling until the last second, staging one final scene of defiance. But no, at 9:02 a.m., the low rumble of an engine announced their surrender. A battered moving truck pulled up, dented sides rattling as it struggled against the slope of the driveway. It was almost comical, two people who had dreamed of lake houses and grand inheritances, now reduced to hiring the cheapest truck they could find. I rose, set my teacup on the side table, and pulled the curtain slightly aside. This was my moment to witness, not interfere. The first to emerge was Ethan. His shoulders were hunched, his jaw tight, his once pristine jacket wrinkled and stained. He barked orders at Savannah as if authority could disguise defeat. She followed behind him, her hair pulled back into a messy knot, makeup smeared from either exhaustion or tears. They didn't look like victors, they looked like refugees of their own arrogance. Piece by piece, they hauled their lives out of the house. The enormous black television, once a symbol of their dominance, looked cheap and awkward as they wrestled it through the door. The sleek gray sofa scraped against the frame, leaving marks on the walls they had so eagerly redecorated. And the coffee machine, the crown jewel of their consumer pride, was shoved into a box and carried out like nothing more than clutter. Noah came last, clutching a small box of toys. His face was pale, confused, his eyes searching the house as though it might explain itself to him. At the end of the driveway, he stopped, turned back, and looked at the house. My heart clenched. He was too young to understand the greed and betrayal that had poisoned this place, but he felt the fracture. Of all of us, he was the only true victim. I pressed my hand to the glass, whispering to myself, "You'll be okay, sweetheart. You'll always be okay with me." From my vantage point, I could see everything the way Ethan's voice rose in frustration when a box tore, spilling clothes onto the wet pavement, the way Savannah snapped back at him. Her composure finally cracked beyond repair. Their partnership, once so smugly united against me, was unraveling in real time. The neighbors peeked from behind curtains, their faces curious, maybe even judgmental. The great facade Ethan and Savannah had tried to uphold was gone, reduced to two broken people stuffing their lives into cardboard under the weight of a cloudy sky. I thought of the day Ethan first asked to stay here, claiming it would be 6 months. How polite I'd been, how willing to sacrifice my routines for his temporary setback. 6 months had stretched into 3 years of insults, debts, and disrespect. And now it ended with the screech of packing tape and the slam of truck doors. At noon, the last box disappeared. Ethan wiped sweat from his brow, shot one last look at the house, a glare filled with resentment, not remorse, and climbed into the driver's seat. Savannah lingered for a moment, her eyes darting toward my window. Perhaps she hoped to see pity, to find one last crack in my armor. I gave her nothing. She turned away, climbed into the truck, and closed the door. The engine roared, the gears groaned, and the truck rolled slowly down the street. I stayed at the window until it turned the corner and vanished. Only then did I let my shoulders relax. The silence that followed was different this time. Not tense, not heavy, but expansive. The house exhaled. For the first time in years, it felt like mine again. I walked through each room, my footsteps echoing. Their absence was glaring the walls bare where they had hung their gaudy decorations, the spaces empty where their furniture once loomed. Yet beneath the emptiness was something else, freedom. The house was not a battlefield anymore. It was a canvas waiting to be restored. In the living room, I traced my fingers along the marks their sofa had left on the wall. I smiled faintly. These scars would be painted over, repaired, replaced with things that mattered: my books, my memories, Charles's portrait above the fireplace. Their chaos had left its imprint, but it would fade. By evening, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the eviction notice still tucked neatly into my folder. Outside, the wind rattled the trees, but inside was peace. They were gone. If you've ever watched betrayal load itself into a truck and drive away, you know the strange relief that follows. It's not a celebration. It's not even joy. It's something quieter, deeper, the sound of your own life returning. And in the next chapter, you'll see how their new reality, a cramped apartment with leaky faucets, stood in stark contrast to the sanctuary I reclaimed piece by piece. A week passed before I heard from them again. The house was quiet, blissfully so, the silence filled not with tension but with the hum of my own routines. I had begun the work of reclaiming my space, moving Charles's armchair back into the living room, unboxing my photo albums from the damp basement, and hanging our wedding portrait above the fireplace where it belonged. Each act was a stitch in the fabric of my home, mending what they had torn. Then the phone rang. Savannah's number flashed on the screen. For a moment I considered letting it ring, but something inside me told me to answer. Her voice was thin, frayed. "Mom, the apartment is small, the neighbors are loud, the landlord won't fix the leaky faucet. It's nothing like the house." Her words were heavy with expectation. She wanted sympathy, maybe an offer of money, maybe even an invitation to return. But I had learned my lesson. "I'm sorry to hear that, Savannah," I said, my voice kind but firm. "I hope you're able to make it work." There was a pause, the sound of her breath hitching. Then she hung up. I set the phone down with a steady hand, feeling the final thread of obligation fray and fall away. From neighbors and whispers, I learned more. Ethan and Savannah's new place was a 2-bedroom unit in a tired complex on the far edge of town. The rent was high for what it offered, and the walls were thin enough that arguments spilled into the hall. They didn't own it. They didn't control it. For the first time in years, they were tenants dependent on someone else's rules, someone else's roof. Ethan tried to keep his pride intact, strutting to the parking lot in the mornings as though he were heading to meetings, but reality had stripped him. His car had been repossessed. He relied on borrowed rides, and the once confident swagger had been replaced with furtive glances, always checking if anyone noticed the fall. Savannah fared no better. The glamorous image she had worked so hard to maintain unraveled quickly. Without my credit card to lean on, the shopping trips and salon visits evaporated. She went out less and less, and when she did, it was in jeans frayed at the knees and a jacket she once called outdated. She had always valued appearances above all, but appearances require money. Without it, she was left with nothing but raw truth. And Noah, sweet Noah. His world shrank from a spacious house with a yard to a small bedroom overlooking a cracked parking lot. He told me on one of our weekly visits, "Grandma, I can hear the people upstairs fighting. They fight a lot." His voice was soft, confused, and it broke me. I hugged him tighter and promised him that here, in my home, there would always be peace. It was clear they were unraveling. Ethan tried again to borrow money from friends, from banks, even from Raphael, but the doors kept closing. Raphael had co-signed the lease. Yes, but he refused further help. His disappointment was heavy and final. For a man like Ethan, who lived to impress, that rejection cut deeper than any eviction notice. Savannah resorted to subtle digs when she dropped Noah off. "I just don't know how we'll make it, Mom. Rent, bills, school supplies, it's all so expensive." Her eyes would linger on me, waiting for me to offer, but I never did. I smiled politely, told her I wished them the best, and turned my attention to Noah. They had built their lives on my silence, my generosity, my willingness to bend. But that woman was gone. This was the new me. Boundaries set like stone, no longer negotiable. Meanwhile, my own life blossomed. With them gone, I hosted Clarice for tea without worry that her visits would be overshadowed by Ethan's arrogance. Evelyn came by with flowers, marveling at how different the house felt. "It's lighter," she said, running her hand along the windowsill. "Like the air itself is clean again." She was right. The house wasn't just quieter. It was mine, through and through, every corner infused with the life Charles and I had built. Their chaos had been a storm, but storms always pass. What remains afterward is stronger for having endured. Ethan and Savannah wanted power, control, comfort. What they found instead was a leaky faucet, noisy neighbors, and the echo of their own poor choices. And what I found was peace, the kind that cannot be stolen once you learn to guard it. If you've ever cut ties with those who drained you, you know this truth. Their downfall is not your victory, but their absence is your freedom. And in the next chapter, I'll tell you how I rebuilt my home, piece by piece, until it became not just a house again, but a sanctuary. The house was mine again, but it didn't feel whole yet. Their absence left gaps, scars on the walls and in the air, reminders of how far I had allowed them to intrude. The silence was healing, yes, but it was also raw. I knew I couldn't simply sweep the dust and call it done. I had to reclaim, restore, and rebuild the sanctuary Charles and I had once created. The first step was the basement. For years, it had been their dumping ground, a graveyard for everything they considered clutter. I opened the door and inhaled the damp, musty air. Boxes of their junk cluttered the space-broken lamps, plastic bins of clothes they hadn't touched in years, a treadmill that had never worked properly. And in one corner, half buried under their chaos, sat my life. Photo albums, Charles's armchair, the old sewing machine, the wedding portrait with cracked glass. I rolled up my sleeves and began. It wasn't glamorous work. Dust clung to my sweater, cobwebs tangled in my hair. But with every item of theirs I carried up the stairs and out to the curb, I felt lighter. By the time the sun dipped low that first day, I could finally see the floor again. The basement no longer looked like a tomb. It looked like a foundation, something I could build on. Next came the living room. I dragged Charles's armchair upstairs and set it in the place it had always belonged, by the window where the morning light pooled. The fabric was faded, the pattern outdated, but it was his, and when I lowered myself into it, I felt a kind of embrace I hadn't known in years. I called a local upholstery shop, and within a week the chair returned, freshly cleaned and sturdy, the floral pattern bright again. It was as if time itself had been rewound. The wedding portrait was trickier. I carried it to a framer, explaining how the glass had been cracked when they shoved it into the basement. The man behind the counter examined it gently, as though he understood the weight it carried. When I picked it up days later, the frame gleamed, the glass flawless. Hanging it above the fireplace was like setting a crown on the house again. Charles's smile watched over the room, not as a memory shoved into the dark, but as a presence restored to its rightful place. Piece by piece, I worked through the rooms. I scrubbed the kitchen floors until the tiles shone, wiping away the last stains of spilled wine from that humiliating night. I replaced the gray sofa they had chosen with a warm, inviting couch in deep burgundy, a color that radiated comfort instead of coldness. The shelves they had cleared for their electronics now held my books once more, their spines lined neatly like old friends returned from exile. Neighbors noticed. Clarice came over one afternoon carrying a pie, her eyes widening when she stepped into the living room. "It feels like you again," she said, setting the pie on the counter. "The house, it's warm. It's alive." And it was. Every photo I rehung, every book I returned to its shelf, every chair I placed was an act of reclamation, not just of objects but of myself. Evelyn visited soon after and brought a vase of fresh lilies. She placed them on the dining table, then turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Charles would be proud, Monica. You've brought his home back to life." Her words pierced me, but not with sadness, with strength. For years I had lived as though the best of life was behind me, as though my role was to preserve memories quietly while others took up the space. But standing in that room, surrounded by love and history, I realized something profound. This house wasn't just a relic. It was a living, breathing testament. And so was I. Noah noticed the changes too. When he visited, he curled up in Charles's chair, his small body dwarfed by the size of it, and grinned. "This is Grandpa's, isn't it?" he asked. "Yes," I said, smoothing his hair. "And now it's here to remind us of him." He smiled, a smile so pure it made my chest ache. For him, the house was no longer a place of tension. It was safe, filled with cookies in the oven, and the sound of pages turning when I read to him. The transformation wasn't just physical. With every change, I felt a new layer of strength settle over me. Their betrayal had wounded me, yes, but it had also forced me to uncover resilience I'd forgotten I had. I wasn't just restoring a house, I was restoring a life. If you've ever rebuilt after loss or betrayal, you know the power of reclaiming what was once stolen. It isn't about revenge. It's about resurrection. And in the next chapter, you'll see how I didn't just stop at rebuilding my sanctuary. I expanded it, creating a life outside these walls that was richer than anything I dared imagine. Rebuilding the house was only the beginning. Once the walls stood firm again, once the rooms felt like mine and Charles's spirit seemed to linger warmly instead of being buried, I realized something startling. I didn't want to stop there. For years, I had shrunk myself down to fit into the cracks Ethan and Savannah left me. Now, with the house in order, I felt an unexpected hunger to step outside, to live, to grow. It began small. Clarice invited me to her Wednesday book club. At first, I hesitated. For so long, I had lived in a cycle of caretaking and conflict, my energy consumed by trying to hold my family together. The idea of sitting with women I barely knew, discussing novels, felt foreign. But Clarice wouldn't take no for an answer. "You need to laugh again," she said firmly. So I went. The first meeting was at a neighbor's house down the street, a cozy place filled with chatter and the smell of cinnamon rolls. When I walked in, I was greeted not as Ethan's mother or the woman with a house full of family drama, but simply as Monica. The conversation wandered from books to grandchildren to gardening tips. At one point, a woman named Dorothy cracked a joke so sharp and clever that I laughed so hard my sides ached. It startled me. I couldn't remember the last time I had laughed like that without guilt shadowing it. That night, I went home lighter. I looked around my living room, my restored sanctuary, and realized it was ready to host people again. Not Ethan's friends, not Savannah's pretentious crowd, but my friends, women who saw me as more than an obstacle. By the following month, I was hosting the club at my house every other Wednesday. The rooms rang with laughter, the kind that stitched itself into the walls and filled the empty spaces their betrayal had left behind. Evelyn encouraged me to do more. "You've been hiding behind these walls long enough," she said. "Why don't you take that trip you always talked about?" For years, Charles and I had dreamed of visiting the coast. We planned to walk the shoreline at sunrise, breathe in the salt air, and listen to the gulls cry overhead. Life had intervened, then his illness, and I shelved the dream. But now I had nothing holding me back. So I booked it. 1 week, just me, a modest inn by the ocean. The first morning, I stood barefoot in the sand, the cold tide washing over my toes, and whispered his name into the wind. I felt him there not in grief, but in strength. Each sunrise after that, I walked further down the beach, my lungs filling with the sharp, clean air, my heart filling with something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. I sent Noah a postcard from every town I passed through, scrawling little notes about seagulls and seashells. When I returned, he hugged me tightly and said, "Grandma, I want to see the ocean too someday." "You will," I promised, holding him close. "And when you do, you'll remember that we can always start new adventures, no matter how old we are." Savannah noticed the changes. When she came to drop Noah off one Thursday, her eyes scanned the fresh flowers on my table, the framed photographs of the coast. She looked tired, worn by her cramped apartment and the weight of choices she couldn't undo. "You seem different," she said quietly. "I am," I replied, not with malice but with certainty. "I've stopped living small." "Oh." She didn't answer, just lowered her eyes. I saw envy there, yes, but also something softer, maybe regret, longing for the kind of peace she couldn't manufacture. For a moment, I felt almost sorry for her. Almost. Because here was the truth I had learned. I could not fix them. I could not control their choices, their greed, or their chaos. What I could do was build a life so rich, so authentic, that their absence felt less like loss and more like space gained. I began joining local events, a gardening group, a community choir that met once a month. Each time, I carried with me the lesson of trust, the eviction, the silence of those 30 days. Boundaries don't end your life. They begin it. If you've ever lived through betrayal, you know how tempting it is to retreat, to close the door forever. But sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is open new doors instead. And in the next chapter, You'll see how I balance this new world of freedom with the bond I refuse to let go of, the love between me and my grandson, the one relationship worth salvaging from the wreckage. Through everything, the fall, the betrayal, the eviction, and the silence, there was one light that never dimmed: Noah, my grandson. While Ethan and Savannah's choices had poisoned so much, Noah's innocence had remained untouched, and I refused to let him become collateral damage in their war. Every Thursday, Savannah dropped him off at the curb, avoiding eye contact. Her voice clipped as she muttered, "See you at 5." But the moment Noah's small hand slipped into mine, all of that faded. He belonged here. He belonged in a home filled with love, respect, and stability. We baked cookies, the way I used to with his mother when she was his age. We gardened, planting bulbs that would bloom in spring, each tiny seed a promise that life renews itself no matter how harsh the winter. And we talked about school, about superheroes, about dreams of seeing the ocean. I listened, truly listened, because I knew how it felt to be dismissed, and I would never let him feel that way. One evening, after a day spent painting birdhouses, Noah looked up at me with paint smudged on his cheek. "Grandma," he said softly, "you're really strong, stronger than Dad." I swallowed the ache that rose in my chest. "I'm strong because I have to be, Noah. And one day, you'll be strong too, not because of what you take from people, but because of how you protect them." He nodded, thoughtful, and I realized that this was my true victory. Not the eviction papers, not the restored house, not even my newfound freedom. My victory was showing him another way to live, a way built on love, resilience, and respect. The betrayal had scarred me, yes, but it had not broken me. It had forged me into something sharper, stronger, more certain. And now, as I sat in my chair with Noah's laughter echoing through the halls, I knew this truth. Family is not defined by blood alone. It is defined by who stands with you, who honors you, and who refuses to treat your love as a resource to exploit. I had lost a son to greed, but I had gained a future with my grandson, one built not on control or manipulation but on trust. And that, I realized, was worth everything. If you've ever felt invisible, disrespected, or betrayed by those closest to you, let this story remind you: it is never too late to stand up for yourself. Reclaim your peace, protect your worth. And if this story spoke to you, please like, comment, and subscribe to join our community. Your support means the world, and together, we can make sure voices like mine and yours are never silenced again.